Okay, welcome to everybody here today on Zoom and Facebook, and to those watching later on YouTube. I am Maura Stevens. I'm a member of the System Change, Not Climate Change Coordinating Committee and its editorial board. And today our web guru behind the scenes in a good way is Steve Willett. So if you have any problems with tech during the webinar, please ask him in the chat. That's Steve Willett. So if you're new to us, we'd like to invite you to learn more about our Eco-Socialist Network, which is actually celebrating its 10th anniversary in a couple months, and about eco-socialism in general, if you're not familiar with the concept. After this, I'll drop in the chat a link to our points of unity, which are very clear and very concise. And we hope you'll find yourself identifying with them and sign up for our newsletter and get involved. We understand collectively that fossil fuel capitalism is the cause of our current climate crisis, which all of us are witnessing and experiencing, especially in this chaotic summer and its nonstop temperature-breaking records, smoke-choking storms and floods. We have a better way, and it's articulated through our various media, our website, our webinars like this, and our YouTube videos, and social media. That we really need more people of passion and commitment to join us in this work. And help ramp it up, especially now, as we'll learn from Lisa Graves today, when our work is being targeted by vicious laws that are crafted to stop us by capitalists, to stop us in the environmental, climate, labor protective laws in state houses around the country. So please get in touch with us if you'd like to play a role in our fight for a livable future. I'll drop the contact info in the chat as well. And you can save the chat at the end, by the way, at the end of the presentation, with links and things that'll mean something to you later. So thank you for joining us for this webinar with Lisa Graves, which we've titled ALEC, Criminalizing Climate Action. Now, most of us became aware of this secretive, powerful democracy squelching organization in 2011, thanks to Lisa Graves and an insider whistleblower who had given her organization at the time, the Center for Media and Democracy, more than 800 model bills crafted by this nonprofit organization. But by then, the American Legislative Exchange Council had actually been operating in the shadows for nearly 40 years. And it was behind such laws as South Carolina's voter ID laws, Alabama's Papers, Please immigration laws, and Wisconsin's law to eliminate unions' collective bargaining rights. And since then, ALEC has fallen out of the headlines, but not out of the state houses. Lisa Graves will give us a brief rundown of some of their activities. She'll barely have time to scratch the surface, I suspect, today. And then we'll open it up to a Q&A. Lisa Graves is one of my true heroes. Not only is she one of the nation's foremost experts on how powerful right-wing interests, such as billionaire Charles Koch and billionaire trustee Leonard Leo, distort democracy, but the deep investigative work she did at the Center for Media and Democracy is one of the greatest journalistic endeavors I've witnessed in my 40 years in the field. And she continues to do deep dives, exposing systemic corruption and failures in her more recent role as the founder, executive director, and editor-in-chief of True North Research. Lisa was featured in Ava DuVernay's Oscar-nominated film, The 13, Bill Moyers's United States of ALEC, and other documentaries. Her work launching ALEC Exposed was honored with an Izzy Award from the Park Center for Independent Media, which I was honored to present to her, and many other awards. She served as a senior advisor in all three branches of U.S. government. She has testified as an expert before the House and Senate, appeared on every major U.S. news network, been cited in critically acclaimed books, and been quoted by every major U.S. newspaper and numerous independent media outlets. Her op-eds have been published in major publications in the USA and the UK, and she's an artist and a great wit to boot. I'm fortunate to call her a friend. Now, we'll give our full attention to Lisa Graves, who'll be sharing information we all need to hear and share out. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Mara, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. It made me tear up to hear you talk about my work, and I'm so grateful for your support, and thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm honored to be at this webinar for system change. And thank you all in the audience for coming, for taking the time out of your day to learn more about ALEC and to support the work of Maura and the committee on these and so many other issues where I am proud to join the fight for a livable future with you all. So thank you so much, Maura, and also thank you, Steve Willett, for the tech support here. So I'm going to jump in, and I have a slide deck to share to make it a little more interesting, perhaps. But let me share my screen, and then we will be off to the races on this. Let's see. So I'm going to keep it in slide mode because it's easier for me to move the slides this way, if that's all right with you. The presenter view, I suppose. Can you see that? All right. Can someone give me a heads up? Okay. Actually, I'm going to do it one more time just to make sure that it's operating properly. Okay, so I've been asked to talk about why ALEC is attacking the freedom to assemble and protest. To protest, not just in general, but to protest the industries that are fueling this climate disaster. Some of this you may all know, some of it may be new to you, and definitely looking forward to questions at the end of this session. So a little bit about my work. I work with a small team of researchers, and this is a sample of some of the outlets that our work has been in the past year. We do a lot of research to share information about who is distorting our democracy. And as Mara mentioned, a lot of that work in the past year has been focused on Leonard Leo, who you have probably heard about, who became the leader of a $1 billion trust fund that was created for him by a billionaire in Chicago named Barry Seid, who's an anti-climate change denier, anti-choice, pretty significant extremist in my book, in my opinion, and Leo's role in capturing the US Supreme Court and what that has meant for our democracy and rulings, including the Dobbs decision last year, eliminating Roe versus Wade or reversing it, as well as the decision in the EPA case where the court, this faction of the court has worked to change the rules involving what the EPA can do to address and mitigate climate change. And a lot of other decisions involving using religion as a sword versus a shield, and a lot of other decisions coming down the pipeline. Not to use the word pipeline too loosely, sorry about that. But anyway, so a lot of my work in the last year has been focused a lot on the Supreme Court, and there's more to come. You'll see more beyond the photo that we found of Harlan Crow with Leonard Leo and with Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court and other investigative breakthroughs. So let me move on to the first part of what I wanted to talk with you about, which is this effort to criminalize protest, particularly protests around pipelines. The gold standard in tracking this is really the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, ICNL. They have this. They have a website that includes not just. Oh, that's not them. Sorry. They have a website that includes all of the lists of the bills as they are introduced and what happens with them. And they have noted that more than 40 bills to criminalize protest have passed in the past few years since 2017. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the origin story of that when I talk about ALEC. But if you want to know on a daily basis, weekly basis, what's happening, where bills are popping, what the status of legislation in various states is, definitely go to ICNL's website and you can see it state by state. I also really want to do a shout out to the tremendous work of Connor Gibson, who's a researcher who I worked with when he was at Greenpeace, and now he's an independent researcher. David Armiak at the Center for Media and Democracy, and the team over there at CMD, which is led by Arne Pearson. They have a website called prwatch.org and exposedbycmd.org that I used to run. There's also Ellie Page and the other lawyers at ICNL. They are really in the trenches trying to get material to people in those states as those bills are introduced, or just background information about what's happening, what the history of these measures is. So, and there's obviously a huge coalition that has been fighting these measures, has been trying to block them, trying to let people know what they mean. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those measures, not in detail because there are so many, but when you look at Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, Montana, North Carolina, North Dakota, Ohio, Oklahoma, South Dakota, Tennessee, Texas, Utah, West Virginia, and my home state of Wisconsin, that's where these measures have passed. The common denominator in all but one of those states is Republican control of the legislature and a Republican governor. In Wisconsin, unfortunately, the bill was signed into law by Tony Evers, who's a Democratic governor, has done other good things. This was not a good thing, in my view. These measures have a range of components. They're not the same in every state, but we'll talk a little bit more about that origin story again. But in essence, they're escalating dramatically the penalties for trespass. In some instances where there's a sign where it's posted, in some instances where it's not posted, escalating penalties for blocking traffic. In some states, allowing there to be immunity for people who run over protesters. Just so blatantly immoral and unconscionable, quite frankly. In some states, they're making defacing a piece of critical infrastructure, meaning a pipeline or other facility, making defacing into a felony. So just vandalism being converted into a felony. In some places, they've expanded the limits on protests beyond pipelines to in front of government buildings. For example, in Mississippi, limiting the ability to protest near government offices, the office holders who are responsible for these measures. Arkansas, I think, as well has one of those. If you block traffic, that can be criminalized in a way that it wasn't before. In some states, in West Virginia, they have taken this measure even a step further to basically immunize police for killing or maiming or wounding protesters. Some of these measures in these states have been challenged in court. Some of them have been blocked temporarily, or there are restraining orders on them. But this set of legislation as a whole represents a dramatic escalation on the part of fossil fuel interests and the politicians who serve them in trying to limit the ability of ordinary people to assemble, to protest. And it really, in some ways, came out of the tremendous, wide, deep effort at DAPL, at Standing Rock, and the brave efforts there to really stand up to that pipeline. The way that the water protectors and activists and reporters were treated there is genuinely astonishing, should astonish anyone to know it. But there's more. The Center for Media and Democracy has helped uncover, along with some of their investigative freelancers, bills, basically, where how much the taxpayers are paying to hire private help these fossil fuel companies hire police, and it's not just that. It's also the way that these private police, in essence, have been deputized to in essence arrest people, to perhaps assault them and get away with it. So it really is, it's so extreme. And I know that you all know this from seeing different headlines in the news or hearing about some of these protests or what's happened to individual protesters. But the thing to remember from my point of view is there were already laws on the books for trespass. There are already laws on the books that deal with any of these sorts of instances. But what has happened is there's a desire to try to make it more onerous, to try to put people in jail for longer, and also to apply RICO laws, the laws that were used for created to address the mafia, to try to attack organizers of protests, including organizations. A couple of these laws that have been passed have $100,000 fines for aiding an event or helping to create an event in which one person there or more, one or more person there engages in trespass or impedes a pipeline. So it's just extraordinary, and it comes from the politicians who are the most aggressive in asserting that they're the freedom party, that they stand for freedom. And so there are other things I want to have a bit of a meditation with you about at the end of this conversation about the notion of freedom and what that means to different people. But before I move on, let me just put a slide up. This is from one of the fossil fuel entities, API, I think, American Petroleum Institute. And this is just like their map of where all the pipelines are. So on the left, you've got the liquid pipelines, that's oil. That's also CO2, which we should talk about another time, these CO2 pipelines and what they mean, given the tremendous work of a great investigative reporter, Dan, about Satarsha, what happened in Satarsha, Mississippi. But that's the liquid pipelines. And then this is what they call the natural gas pipelines. I always call it methane pipelines. I've amended their little slide there. One of the most pernicious of all the greenhouse gases. But when you think about this infrastructure, in essence, what you can take from that, obviously, is we have a massive amount of pipeline coverage in America, a massive amount of areas where someone in protesting near one of those sites could be charged with serious crimes just for being on the property. And I think it's important to know that it's not just that component of it. One of the things we saw, I think in North Dakota, it might have been, was the prosecutors were charging people, then dropping the charges, then recharging, basically trying to maximize the expense, what they called financial warfare, to basically really make it very difficult for people to afford defending themselves by starting their defense, then dropping the charges, then waiting and intentionally to recharge them again. That's just one of many tactics that these right-wing office holders have used to try to affect not just those protesters, but also to chill protesting. Okay, so how did we get here? This is really, in many ways, the story of ALEC. So I want to talk about what is ALEC, and the origin story is that the first of these really pernicious draconian measures was adopted in Oklahoma, and then it was taken up as a so-called model bill by ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, which, as Maura mentioned, I launched an expose in 2011 about what ALEC was after a whistleblower gave me all of the bills that had been voted on by ALEC legislators and by ALEC corporations. So let me just pause for a second about that, because when I received these 800 plus bills, I felt like I was reasonably well informed about what was happening in our country, although obviously there are gaps. When I looked at these bills, what I realized was that almost every really terrible bill that I had heard about happening in one state or another for the past 20 or 30 years was an ALEC bill. We just didn't know it. Parental consent laws, for example, for teens, those were ALEC bills. Bills to block the minimum wage, those were ALEC bills. Bills to change the trade policy, for example, to limit people's ability to block some of these trade bills, those were ALEC resolutions. We even discovered that ALEC was the front-facing entity back way before the internet was a thing for the public. ALEC was the front-facing entity in anti-apartheid measures. So they were the organization organizing efforts to protect businesses from divestment in South Africa in the 1980s. There's more about that, and I'll tell you a little more about that in a moment. But let me just describe the thing that shocked me, that stood out to me, was among these bills was a document that was a promo document for the corporations, and it was basically telling the corporations what they would get for giving money to ALEC, and they were told that they would get a voice and a vote. A voice and a vote on legislation. Now, I had been in Washington for a number of years and had worked on the Hill. I was the chief counsel for nominations for Senator Leahy on the Senate Judiciary Committee. And I had never once heard of, Nancy Pelosi having a meeting in which Greenpeace and the ACLU and Sierra Club and whomever else, Planned Parenthood, get to vote on a bill before it's introduced. Never. But that's what happens at ALEC meetings. At ALEC meetings, the corporations they pay to have a seat at a table on a task force. And on that task force, they get a vote. They vote, and so do the legislators, these state legislators. Now, ALEC has claimed it has more than 2,000 legislators that are members. The Center for Immune Democracy has exposed that it's much less than that, much lower, but still thousands, over 1,000 legislators. And that these legislators are so supine to the corporate interests that they are willing to go to a fancy conference and go behind closed doors and let corporations have an equal voice and vote to themselves on these bills. And then they introduce these bills in the state houses without any reference to ALEC. They hide the fact that they were ALEC bills. And then usually they don't let anyone amend them because they've already been pre-approved by the corporations that are really the ones calling the shots. Sometimes you'll hear people say that ALEC makes model bills or creates model bills. That's a bit of a misnomer, because what ALEC is, I'm going to just fast forward to this little slide. As Mark Pocan, when he was in the State House, now he's in Congress in the Progressive Caucus, said that, ALEC is a dating service between legislators and special interests. It matches them up, builds relationships, and culminates in the birth of special interest legislation. What that really means is that the corporations are writing the bills, the special interest groups are writing the bills. That's how the process works. So the lobbyists come, they bring their bills, they write the ALEC bills, the bills get introduced, and then the PACs that are associated with these corporations or America's Prosperity, kind of help max out on elections or do some dark money work around the elections. We'll talk about dark money another time, perhaps in great detail, Maura. But for now, suffice it to say, that's the sort of cycle that we've helped describe. So what does it mean for ALEC to call itself the largest voluntary body of state legislators in the country? Well, when we looked at ALEC's revenue, we discovered that only 1% of its revenue comes from legislators. 99% of its revenue comes from corporations, special interests, or right-wing foundations. So is it really a legislative organization, or is that the front? Is that the window dressing, basically, for what is, in essence, a corporate access machine, one-stop shopping for getting to these legislators? So what happened in Oklahoma was that bill was passed in Oklahoma, that first set of anti-protest bills. ALEC took it up the next year at its annual meeting through its task forces. The corporate lobbyists and special interest groups on that task force voted for it. It moved to the ALEC board. The ALEC board is sort of an empty suit operation, where its official board on its tax filings is legislators, but its real board, in my view, is its private sector advisory board, which is the corporations that really are there year in, year out, bankrolling ALEC. And what happens is, it's a little bit like, I'm going to call it like Christmas, even though I'll save my commentary about Christmas for another day. But basically, the state legislators in the board vote in favor of the bills that were adopted by the task force, and the private sector business leaders don't vote, they just observe. And that's kind of like Santa Claus noticing if you're naughty or nice, basically, like they're voting for these bills. Then it becomes the model bill. Now, let me pause before I get to the kind of billionaire part of this. So this didn't just happen with this Critical Infrastructure Protection Act, which is the name of the model bill. This happens all the time. It happens hundreds of times a year. And there are a couple examples that I will mention, one now and one later. So in 2008, after the 2008 presidential election, after Obama was elected with tremendous a surge of voters in the cities and college students, ALEC took up the next year in 2009 a voter ID bill to make it harder for Americans to vote. And make it harder for these Americans to vote. People who live in cities who might not have driver's licenses, college students who don't re-register their car just because they move dorms or move apartments. Democratic voters, basically. Who was on that task force? The National Rifle Association chaired the task force meeting for ALEC, where ALEC voted on making voter ID restrictions a model bill. There were other corporations too. We know that one of those corporations that was on or off that task force in this time frame, we've never seen the smoking gun document, is Koch Industries. They were on that task force in that same time frame, but we don't have the document showing that they did. Another example of this pay-to-play operation is that when the private prison bills were moving in Arizona, Corrections Corporation of America was part of the task force where those bills were moving, claims it never voted on those bills. It abstained, like Santa Claus observed what other legislators did in the room. Similar situation with the sanctuary cities bills and immigration. CCA, which stood to benefit from immigration detention, was in the room, said it didn't vote. But we have found vote tallies until ALEC stopped distributing them through that we obtained through open records requests. We have seen vote tallies where we know, in fact, it still is the case that corporations and legislators vote as equals on these bills. I think I've got about 15 minutes left, Mara. Is that okay? Yeah?
Take as long as you like.
Okay. All right. Well, so now I'm going to get to one of my favorite topics, Koch Industries. So when you think about that ALEC corporate board, their private sector advisory board, who is on it? Well, it's big tobacco. It's been some big pharma, big telecom, and Koch Industries. In fact, Koch Industries has had a seat on ALEC's corporate board since the early 1990s. So 30 years now, one of the main funders of ALEC has been Koch Industries. Not just that, Koch Industries previously chaired the board. Koch Industries has given loans to ALEC to bail it out when it's had financial hard times. Koch Industries has given hundreds of thousands of dollars through its various means to help shore up ALEC, including money from the Koch from the Koch fortune. So the money that Charles Koch takes from that fortune of Koch Industries. It's given money to fund publications like this thing called Rich States, Poor States, which is one of the most ridiculous publications I've ever seen in my life. And I used to read Mad magazine. And Cracked, by the way, Cracked magazine too. I wasn't just a one-time aficionado. But they publish this thing called Rich States, Poor States every year, in which they claim that, for example, Wisconsin's economy is better than California's or New York's or whatever, because it's basically not, are you a rich state or a poor state, but are you, maybe a way to reframe it is like, are you advancing the richest interests possible in that state? And Wisconsin under Walker was doing just that. So it's just nonsensical, in my view, description of whether the states are good. But besides whether a state is rich or not, the real question is how is the economy working for real people? And do we have a sustainable environment? Do we have the conditions to help us thrive? Anyway, of course we don't, in part because of the influence of this guy, Charles Koch. I know you've seen him. That's him in a tuxedo. You rarely see him in a tuxedo at an event sponsored by the fabulous champagne brand of Moet and Chandon. But there he is in his tux, not looking like just the ordinary Kansas business guy that he is. In fact, Charles Koch is one of the richest men in the world. Not as rich as Elon Musk, but in the billions and billions of dollars. His brother's estate also worth billions and billions of dollars. That was David, who passed away a couple of years ago. His company is one of the richest companies in the world. It's one of the largest. It alternates between the first and second largest privately held corporation in the US, one of the largest in the world. At one point, I had calculated that they were making on gross revenue something like $20 million every 20 minutes. Like, it's just sort of an unfathomable amount of wealth. At another point, I calculated how much Charles Koch, he gives millions of dollars to these efforts to reshape American society to make it look like what he wants. But I had figured out, like, if he gave $1 million, which he gives way more than $1 million to advance these interests and to push these extreme agendas, but if he gave $1 million to something based on his wealth, that's like someone who makes $40,000 giving $5 to something. Like, that's the scale of his wealth. So who is Charles Koch? You've heard of him, but have you heard this? This is a guy who, basically believes that taxes are theft. He doesn't believe in minimum wage, any sort of wage or price control. Doesn't believe in any trade rules. Basically, opposes so-called equal employment opportunities. Opposes safety and health regulations, land use regulations, licensing. He claims that America is not, we do not have a free capitalistic economy because we dare to have some regulation of businesses. That was his view back then. It has carried through in all these ways through these different organizations that he's funded. And he was shaped by some of the most extremist thinkers in the mid-century America. These include people like Ayn Rand, F.A. Hayek, Milton Friedman, von Mises, Murray Rothbard, Bob Lefebvre, who was an anarcho-capitalist. Not the only one among them. Let me just go forward just to emphasize how extreme his worldview is. It doesn't matter how nice his tie is or his tux. He is an extremist in terms of his antipathy toward government. There's a thing you hear about from time to time called the Institute for Humane Studies, IHS. Was created by his buddy Murray Rothbard, who described himself as an enemy of the state. And Murray said, capitalism is the fullest expression of anarchism, and anarchism is the fullest expression of capitalism. Of course, they've gotten away from describing it that way. It's not very helpful to their message, but those are the true roots. And one of the related roots of that is from the Powell Memo, which I'm sure you've heard about. Many of you have heard about. It was written by a tobacco lawyer who was tapped by Nixon subsequent to this memo to become a member of the US Supreme Court. And he wrote a memo in which he attacked the idea that Americans would be passing clean air legislation or clean water legislation in the aftermath of the Santa Barbara spill way back when, 40 years ago, almost 50 years ago. He had the audacity to claim in a memo to the US Chamber of Commerce that few elements in American society have as little influence in government as the American businessman, the poor American businessman in 1971, or corporations or corporate stockholders. This is the mindset that has transformed so much of American politics, because all these corporations, these CEOs like Koch, invested in this idea and have worked to basically make this, it wasn't true then, but it certainly isn't true now. And ALEC is one of the means in which they've done so. In fact, Koch has said that Powell's memo didn't go far enough. At a meeting of the Institute for Humane Studies, that group that was created by Murray Rothbard. So moving on. So how did this all work? You have money coming in to support ALEC through these Koch corporations. Some of the Koch groups get multiple votes at ALEC meetings, like Koch's Americans for Prosperity, which I call Americans for Greed. You also have these think tanks. They call themselves think tanks. They're really just sort of propaganda machines that are designed to affect the reality that many universities do not take the same position if their academic research is truly independent. So they have to create a think tank to say that these things are good ideas. They have this thing called the State Policy Network, which is also Koch funded. It's in the states to try to back up this legislation by claiming it's good for the local effort. You have the alt-right echo chamber that happens, online. You have, right-wing media. And then you also have these other Koch-funded special interests. Now, it's not just Koch. Some of these other billionaires are in on this same thing, but Koch, in my view, has the longest, deepest, and most intensive effort since the 1970s to try to reshape American society. And he's done so through a number of groups. I worked with Mark Fiore to create a video that it's like a little naming machine: Americans for Puppies, Americans for Apple Pie, Americans for Prosperity, American Legislative Exchange Council. There's all these groups that have these fancy sounding names, but in fact, they're really fronts for billionaires for the most part. And these billionaires create elaborate structures for their nonprofit structure. This is an old version of a map. Connor Gibson has a newer version, but it doesn't fit laterally on the screen. But it's like this, it's almost like a tax shell. Like you'd see something like that in the Caribbean with someone having shell corporations for money. It's like all these different groups money being funneled to echo their message in society to try to change these rules. And as I said, it's not just Coke. You have someone like Betsy DeVos who says, of course we want a return on our investment. Of course we're buying influence. Like when they're honest, she actually gave another speech in which she was honoring Tom DeLay, who some of you may remember, the exterminator who became the Speaker of the House. She said at a speech honoring him, she doesn't just want her money to talk, she wants it to scream, which I think is almost taken from a Bob Dylan quote, that money doesn't talk, it screams. She basically said she wanted her money to speak as loudly as possible. That's the mindset that they have. So what are their goals? Their goals are weakening unions, privatizing prisons. That was a prior set of bills, eliminating worker protections, gutting environmental laws, attacking health rights, healthcare, limiting voter access by these voter ID restrictions, preempting the efforts of local progressive municipalities, privatizing schools, denying climate change, or at least thwarting it through claiming that there isn't enough science or isn't enough information to proceed, or the government shouldn't do it, the private sector should. This is another version of that. I won't read them all to you, but you can see examples of the names of the bills. One of the things I did when I launched ALEC Exposed was to rename all the bills, because their names are always like so nice. It's the Environmental Services Public-Private Partnership Act. It's just the Power Plant Siting Act. We basically renamed them all to show people what those bills actually did in education, in health, immigration, etc. Another version of the many terrible things they do. And I'll just note before I get to the sort of the end of this, that one of ALEC's main efforts has been to change the rules for the maps, which are how we determine, how it is determined where we vote, who we can vote for. And so redistricting is one of the areas in which they focused. And of course, they have relied on one of the most notorious right-wing lawyers in the country to help them with that, a woman named Cleta Mitchell, who you've probably heard about because she was the person in the phone call the famous phone call in Georgia with Trump asking Brad Raffensperger to just find, a few more thousand votes. That's Cleta. So when Cleta came to an ALEC meeting to tell these ALEC legislators about, how to do the redistricting, she not only was helping them to do this gerrymandering, she also told them to destroy their notes so that people wouldn't be able to see the notes from her talk. It's not just maps, it's also voter ID restrictions. It's also efforts to stop disclosure rules in response to the terrible Citizens United decision, which I call Billionaires United, way back from 2010, the Supreme Court decision by the John Roberts Court that unleashed this tsunami of dark money that has been engulfing our elections. They even have a relatively recent effort to try to repeal the constitutional amendment to allow the direct election of US senators. They do not want you to be able to influence who really is in positions of power representing us. You can see the result of that in states like Wisconsin, for example, where on a statewide basis, a Democrat can win the governorship or the attorney general position because there's no map, it's just the state. But where they draw the lines, where the ALEC legislators draw the lines, they've drawn it so that Wisconsin has a Republican-dominated Senate, Republican-dominated legislature, completely out of proportion to the actual way in which voters vote in the state if they were allowed to vote without these maps. So it's not just elections, it's also labor. They've been trying to block any minimum wage for years, preempt local cities who want to have minimum wage, pushing the so-called right to work laws, which are really about blocking our ability to organize in unions and more. They've urged withdrawal from climate change agreements. They have made outrageous claims to legislators, like actually claiming that CO2 is good for you. They had a panel presentation at one point in which the presenter, I think it was Roger Pilkey, said you should put your foot on the gas. And he made the outrageous claim to the ALEC legislators that I think it was Pilkey, if not Pilkey was another presenter by them, but the presenter said that because lifespan has increased in the 20th century and burning of carbon has increased in the 20th century, therefore climate change, or therefore carbon is good for you, helps you live longer. Total fallacy. Another presenter they had was a weather guy who claimed it's actually getting colder. Just, they basically give them all sorts of options. They've done work to try to expand drilling on public lands, to try to attack any incentives for solar, opposing carbon taxes, opposing windfall taxes. That's not all. They've also been pushing for these massive tax giveaways, no windfall profits tax, as I mentioned, limiting the ability to tax capital gains, limits on taxes to fund budgets for things that we all need, public parks, public schools, public swimming pools, public roads, urging privatization of public roads. And they've also been involved in measures to make it more dangerous, like the so-called stand your ground laws that were at issue when Trayvon Martin was murdered in 2012. But not just that, also privatizing prisons and criminalizing dissent. So what can you do to learn more about ALEC? You can go to ALEC Exposed. You can track down the documentary Bill Moyers narrated, United States of ALEC. There's cartoons that help tell the story of Schoolhouse Rock, but from an ALEC perspective. There's more. And there's an ongoing coalition that's working to help mark ALEC's 50th anniversary this year with materials for 2024 to help people push back on the efforts coming in the wave of things next year, including more efforts to assail the right to vote, which have been not just fueled by this Charles Koch funded ALEC, but also by Leonard Leo's so-called Honest Elections Project and more. And through the work of activists across the country, we pushed out more than 100 corporations, including a few last year. But now it's sort of consolidated to corporations who are predominantly right-wing, less responsive to the public, and more, more resistant. Corporations like Koch Industries, Marathon Oil, Energy and Future Holdings, Peabody, American Electric Power, Cheniere, Duke, Shell, the fossils, right? And the railroad companies that are profiting hugely from transporting fossil fuels like CSX. So I'm going to conclude on hopefully a more positive note, which is, what can we do now? What now? That's for us to work on with our activist allies across the country, with the networks that you're in. What do we do? But I will just say that these are moral issues. These are not just policy fights, and more people are awakened than ever before. We outnumber them. The challenge is, how can we get our voices heard? And how can we do so in a way that is safe, given what's been happening with these anti-protest measures that have been fueled by Marathon and ALEC, which is the Koch-fueled operation here. People are mad, and I think rightly so, about what's happening. And I think as these terrible climate changes unfold, it's only going to increase activism. And so when I think about what we can do, what we need to do, I think about our history and the tremendous civil rights movement, the people who really came to the streets in nonviolent protests to really address these matters. And I'm always encouraged, I'm going to conclude on this note, I'm always encouraged by the speech that Martin Luther King Jr., Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. gave for his Nobel Prize winning speech, in which he specifically talked about the thousands of faceless, anonymous, relentless young people, Black and white, whose courageous acts were a refreshing oasis in the heat of injustice, and for the ennobling power of nonviolence to awaken the conscience of the great and decent majority who, through blindness, fear, pride, and irrationality, have allowed their consciousness to sleep. We have a lot to deal with in terms of how asleep some people are, and so willfully asleep people are. I myself, I'm not focused, for example, on the Trump fans. I'm focused on the other 60 to 65%, and helping them wake up and realize what's happening to our planet, what's happening for our future, and how together we can overcome the influence, this grossly distorting influence of these billionaires. So you can reach me through these ways, along with Evan Vorpal, who's my lead researcher on this work. And with that, I'm going to end the PowerPoint and open the floor to questions. I hope that, I know there was a lot, but I hope it was helpful.
Wow, you did pack in a lot, Lisa. Thank you. Scary as it all is. And and nice to end on an upbeat note, which we always try to do, which would be more upbeat if we had more people joining us in our fights. We had several questions in the chat, and we actually had a few sent early on. And of course, the biggest question of everybody will ask is, what can we do about it? But we'll ask it in pieces instead of like the big overall thing, like you're going to have all the answers to this problem that's been growing for 50 years. I can't believe it's 50 years now, this shady operation. We already know that corporations exist and operate virtually outside the law. Are there any current laws that ALEC is actually breaking? Aren't there any laws that legislators themselves are breaking, at least, that whether they're obscure laws, if they've been on the books since 1460, whatever, you know, or 1860, whatever? Are there any such laws that nobody has really had the legal means to pursue that we might be able to as researchers?
Well, I think let me just start by saying this work and the work that the work that the Center for Democracy has done on this, in particular on this question of are there ways to do a legal challenge, work by the ICNL, the Center for Nonprofit Law. None of that work to pursue, you know, kind of what is the law, what are these corporations, what are these entities doing, how is this affecting human rights? None of that would happen without the support of foundations who are devoted to progress, foundations like the Park Foundation and others that have really helped make sure that there's infrastructure to respond to ALEC, to respond to these sorts of challenges. And so I know that the Center for Media Democracy in particular has looked at making complaints. I helped support IRS complaints against ALEC because despite sending out documents to the legislators saying that they had, you know, one passage of this bill, et cetera, like taking credit for it and actually thanking the legislators for passing their bills, ALEC repeatedly for years told the IRS it engaged in zero lobbying, zero,
Right.
not a single bit of lobbying. There were 3 IRS complaints that were filed. One was by Common Cause, one was from VLTP, the Voters Legislative Transparency Project, and then another complaint. The IRS complaint process is opaque, I would say. They don't tell you what the result is. They don't let you know what happened. ALEC is still in business, in essence. There were some changes to how they describe their bills. They now call them policies, not bills, as if that makes them not bills, but just they call them policies. So that presumably was an outcome there. I also spearheaded an IRS complaint specifically about Exxon, and how Exxon had been telling its shareholders that it was acting responsibly on climate, that it was trying to address the climate crisis and spending money on PR, not just for its shareholders, but for the public. In essence, in my view, lying to people about its role, but then also showed what Exxon was funding behind the scenes in ALEC, all these different measures to thwart efforts to mitigate climate change. Again, we've heard nothing from the IRS about that complaint. And as you all may know, those complaints were filed in a climate in which since 2011, the right wing has been attacking the IRS, claiming that they're persecuting the Tea Party, et cetera. And who was the lawyer who spearheaded those attacks on the IRS? Cleta Mitchell, the very same lawyer who's been at the heart of aiding Trump in these voter suppression and gerrymandering sorts of efforts to aid the Republican Party. So IRS complaints are a tactic we pursued. And Arn Pearson at CMD has also pursued complaints with state oversight boards about the fact that ALEC has been providing its legislators with software to help them interact with their constituents, software that also includes basically voter management software. So far, none of those complaints have prevailed before the state bodies. I think there are still a few pending, one which seems particularly promising. But the bottom line is that unfortunately in this area, I think as with what we've seen with dark money and the Citizens United decision, is that we exist in an environment in which what most people would believe is corrupting or bribery is legalized, is lawful. And so we don't have the kind of robust legal regime that we should have to protect against the type of corruption and influence peddling that ALEC represents. I remain hopeful that we will ultimately have a wave of those reforms, but right now we don't have very many good options from a legal standpoint. And the last thing I'll say is that the Center for Constitutional Rights, and I think some of the lawyers connected with ICNL, have been working to challenge those individual protest laws on grounds of them being unconstitutionally vague or impeding legitimate First Amendment rights. And so there is litigation to challenge some of those particular measures. Some of that has been successful, some of that has not.
Sounds like we should all be supporting ICNL. Thank you for that. And that information's in the chat also. Well, I mean, is there any possibility that ALEC could ever be shut down as long as Citizens United stands? I mean, are there any hopes of overturning Citizens United? Really, it comes down to.
Well, ALEC, you know, we really did hit it hard for a number of years and continue to work to expose it. There's so many people, so many reporters who have now looked into ALEC and are on a monthly basis even talking about different components of ALEC's disastrous agenda. In terms of shutting it down, I think it's very difficult because basically big tobacco is going nowhere. It continues to, help fuel ALEC. Coke Industries and Coke continue to fuel ALEC. So they're going to have like some of the worst corporations in my personal view, are going to continue to back it, give it the money to operate. Right now, its operating budget is about $10 million a year. It's such a generous budget that it's able to pay its executive director, Lisa Nelson, a former Gingrich aide, $300,000 a year and a $100,000 bonus. That's what that nonprofit is up to right now. So I think that we can continue to make it hard for other corporations to join ALEC. We can continue to say this corporation, ALEC has been involved in so much disastrous policy making that you cannot in good conscience join it, which is one of the efforts that Color of Change and Rashad Robinson pursued after we launched ALEC Exposed, to really talk to corporations about what ALEC was doing to the Black community, how its efforts were hurting the constituents of Color for Change. And that was effective and remains effective. But for some corporations like State Farm, which has, presumably a bunch of nice agents, but is led by a CEO and a lobbyist who are super right wing, they don't appear to be going anywhere. And so it's hard to put pressure on them. The broader question of Citizens United, we need to reform that. That needs to be overturned. That needs to be removed because it has allowed billionaires like Charles Koch, Jeffrey Yass in Pennsylvania, Dick Uihlein, the guy from the Uihlein boxes, but who is another super rich right-wing and climate change denying billionaire. It has allowed them grossly disproportionate influence on our democracy. And now Leonard Leo with his becoming $1 billion trust fund baby with the funding from Barry's side, the climate change denying 90-some-year-old billionaire in Chicago. These handful of men have totally disproportionate influence on our politics. And along with the lesser billionaires or lesser millionaires who've been funding Trump and bankrolling him with his, calls to fascism and dog whistles and more, or not even dog whistles, megaphones. So we have a billionaire problem in America, and we do outnumber them. We have the capacity numerically to beat them, to win. But they're busy rigging the rules to try to make sure that we can't overcome them. And so we have a lot at stake in 2024 and beyond to try to protect against them gaining more power and to push them back.
Well, we really have a capitalism problem, as we eco-socialists would be ready to point out again and again, because we wouldn't have gotten to this point had we been under a different system. Capitalism enables this. It almost guarantees it. It can't operate without growing and growing and growing, and that means fewer and fewer growing. So are there any actually organizations trying to make their own cookie cutter laws on the other front, on the side of climate justice, environmental justice, worker rights, et cetera? Are there any organizations who might actually be crafting laws or helping state houses craft laws that benefit people and nature?
Well, there is a group that was created to counter ALEC. It's called the State Innovation Exchange, SIX. And what it does predominantly is provide sort of communication support for legislators about these issues, materials about these issues. They can't replicate ALEC because ALEC's $10 million budget comes from corporations that are getting a return on their investment. And SIX is in support of regulation of corporations to protect our environment and our planet. So, they do have some foundation support for that work. They are not nearly as large as ALEC. They don't have the reach, and they'll never have the allure of ALEC, because one of the things that ALEC does isn't just this sort of soup to nuts, basically you're going to get maxed out on your campaign donations, the not dark money. You're going to get support from the dark money operations. And you're going to get wined and dined and schmoozed and boozed at these ALEC meetings 2 times a year, where literally, and I saw this with my own eyes, they walk around with cigars on a silver platter to give to the legislators at the tobacco party, or the wine at the fabulous wine party, or the all expense paid fab dinners at the restaurant, where these state legislators are basically treated like kings and queens, and then they're rewarded for doing so. SIX is not.
Don't forget the NRA shooting gallery.
Oh yeah. So I forgot to mention, I skipped ahead on that slide. One of the things that ALEC has done or was doing was, right before Trayvon Martin was murdered, the last measure of the task force that was basically democracy and crime. It was their elections and crime task force. One of the last acts of that task force in December of 2011 was to pass a measure to bar states from borrowing machine guns and armor-piercing bullets. And then the NRA left ALEC, but they were still holding these little shooting events on the Saturday of every ALEC meeting, where they go and shoot. And then, in fact, even after they officially left ALEC, ALEC sponsored an event at a shooting range in Arizona that was like on the Saturday after the ALEC convention. And at that shooting range, the legislators got to shoot a machine gun, and they auctioned off an AR, an assault rifle at that meeting. So they're still playing footsie with the NRA, and they've done nothing to get those measures repealed. Sorry for that detour.
I just that was one of the more astonishing features of their parties. The NRA is so visible. I mean, there's just no hiding anything anymore. They were shadowy. Now they're shadowy because we don't hear about them very much, certainly not in the mainstream, but they're really open about it, as you pointed out, with some of the braggadocio coming from the legislators, so-called. So we had a few other questions that came during the conversation, and to hear is to my mind really critical, because so many of us on this call are activists who go out and put ourselves on the line, or have done so in the past. And she says, what can be done for organizers who are being targeted for RICO? How can climate activists keep safe? Is there any way that's currently legal to stop this chilling of our activist activities?
Well, there are legal teams that are certainly in place to help support folks when there are protests, and I know that the coalition that has been working on countering these bills, the coalition that includes people like Connor Gibson and David Armiak and Ellie Page and ICNL, that there is a concerted effort to have sort of a legal defense team and also advice to support people who are organizing event, to protect them from getting caught in the crosshairs here. But it's also the case that it is a bit of a roving challenge because some of these measures are so broad in terms of their description of what's critical infrastructure or even protesting government, that it makes it very difficult. I don't have a lot of confidence in this U.S. Supreme Court, which has been captured by billionaire funded efforts through Leonard Leo, actually defending the First Amendment. I'm concerned that this court is even going to take down the libel standard in New York versus Sullivan. That's on the sort of possible chopping block. But it's possible, given the ruling that they made in a case a few years ago involving access to sidewalks by anti-choice protesters. There was a decision that they issued a few years back about the importance of being able to have face-to-face communication as part of protest, that these measures are in direct contravention of that recent Supreme Court ruling. Of course, they may not be consistent. They have not chosen to be consistent or follow precedent necessarily if it doesn't suit them. So we'll see. I guess the other thing that I would say is, I think it's certainly worth considering, and I know activists consider these questions all the time in terms of where the locations of events are. But in terms of getting earned media coverage, certainly the capital areas are likely to get coverage, or more likely to get coverage. But also, the banks that are bankrolling these fossil fuel companies, they're not critical infrastructure. They don't have a pipeline in front of their bank. And protests at the people who are helping to leverage these big fossil fuel efforts to continue to maximize the production of fossil fuel as our planet burns. There are other places where protests can be had. I'm not trying to suggest at all to the devoted protesters that they not protest at a pipeline. Each of those events is based on the decisions of the community. But I think it's worth expanding the question of banks, railroads, and other key enablers of this fossil fuel infrastructure as additional possible locations for visibility, for shining a light on who is funding and profiting from this disaster.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion. So let's see. Paul asks if people, I guess he means legislators in state houses, acquiesced to bad policy in order to show themselves in solidarity against Trump and MAGA.
Can you say that last part again?
In order to show them that they're anti-MAGA and anti-Trump, do they acquiesce to bad policy? I'm not sure how that works exactly, but that's his question.
Yeah, it's interesting because, and I appreciate that question, because Trump tried to portray himself as an outsider helping the little guy. Actually, I have my mug, although this is not entirely accurate. It says "Make America Rational Again." I don't know if it was ever fully rational, but like we were making some progress, right? But anyway, given the fact that he will sometimes rail on corporations, or you see DeSantis attacking Disney, there's this new variant within the GOP that is not as, quote, free market as like the Koch Koch has pushed, but they still continue to support the GOTV effort, the Get Out the Vote effort that has helped Trump win in 2016 and almost win in 2020. So you have a question of like their, quote, principle of free market fundamentalism, and then the reality, which is it's all about power. And so I don't know that there's daylight between like a legislator who might say, signal they're being anti-Trump by being in a different position on corporations, because to me, what we've seen devolve is that it's all inconsistent optics anyway. Whatever manages to rile that base at that particular moment, they do. They don't feel any obligation, it seems, to have a principle about anything, even including the First Amendment, which is what these bills are about.
Yeah, we have some more questions from Heidi, who asks a two-part type. Have any of our people tried to infiltrate ALEC to find out what they're doing to expose them? And we know that Mark Pocan, the legislator from Wisconsin, did so years ago, but has anyone been doing that more recently? That's the first part of the question, and more importantly, to counteract their efforts. And the second part is, is there a way to get more word out about all the companies who are involved with ALEC? She says she didn't know that State Farm was so evil. Her mom was sold on it by a nice sales rep. So she's wondering if there's a list of companies, current companies. I believe that ALEC Exposed still has one, but she also wonders if you can give a recommendation for an alternative, and whether a boycott app is something that people could be using for this.
Yeah, I at one point thought about whether I should create an app that was like, buy this, not that. This was early on in the early work on ALEC. But then I was like, it was hard for me to endorse then some of the alternative companies because of their labor policy or their anti-environment policy. It was very hard to choose, but I applaud Boycott for its effort to try to give people information about kind of where the least harm is on a given issue. I support that. I found it too complicated to do myself. We actually did a big action around State Farm, and we got a bunch of calls from State Farm agents saying, we don't support this, it's not us. And we sort of said, fair enough, but too bad, because your head guy and your head lobbyists are 100% committed to ALEC. And so there is a list that I first compiled and that CMD has maintained on CMD's sourcewatch.org website. It has a list of all the corporations who've been known to fund ALEC. And then the ones who dropped out and come back, they're marked in there. So you can see it on SourceWatch. If you search for sourcewatch.org corporations and ALEC, you'll see which corporations are still in ALEC. In terms of people attending ALEC, because it claims to be a nonpartisan organization, has not refused when Democratic members like Mark Pocan or others have gone to the meetings to let people know what's happening there. And so there have been members of state legislatures, as well as mayors and city council people who have gone to ALEC meetings and then written about their experiences. And we strongly encourage that. So there is an ongoing effort to continue to make sure the public is aware of what ALEC is up to and how harmful it is. And that includes legislators being willing to take time out of their schedule to go and alert the public to the meetings that they're allowed to get into that we can't be in behind the scenes. I will say one of the meetings Mark attended, Mr. Rep. Pocan attended, was one where it was in New Orleans, and the Texas legislator for ALEC was describing to the new legislators for ALEC this question of like, what's the role of these lobbyists, the private sector, and what's your role? And he basically told this Texas legislator told the members, you're like the players on the football field and these are your coaches. So that's, we would not have known that. We knew that that was sort of the reality, but we would have not have known that that happened had Rep. Pocan not been in the room.
Joel Cooperman asks the elephant in the room question. I'm sorry, that's David Holmquist. So there are several questions came in all at once. All we're hearing is about aiming spitballs at the system. This is supposed to be about system change. How do we change the system? Well, if we had the answer to that, we'd all be engaged in it, wouldn't we? We at System Change, Not Climate Change, are working to educate about eco-socialism and alternatives to capitalism. But without mass numbers of people joining us, it's not going to happen. So we invite anybody who's really pissed off by this education that we're getting today to check us out and join us, because the more people working at it, the more likely we are to overthrow this destructive system that is, hastening the demise of the human race and many other species. So getting back to the, you may have more answers about how to change the system. Lisa, you've been involved in it way deeper than most of us. You have sacrificed so much, and you've been involved in all three branches of the government. So your insight is really unusual.
Well, I have testified against the FBI, against the Department of Homeland Security, and against the National Security Agency, among others, in terms of their policies to try to better protect civil liberties. So I think that we have to stand up to this effort to have the corporations redirect our criminal policies or criminal law to advance and protect against fundamental American rights like the freedom to protest. And we have to resist that. We have to resist that and counter. And the first step to countering it is to know it's happening, right? So it may seem not very powerful to hear this information, but we can't change it unless we know about it and more people know about it, and can help say this is not who we should be. This is not what we need. We need a 21st century democracy that actually protects our future, that protects and helps our families thrive and helps our planet thrive, versus killing it for maximizing quarterly profits for these energy corporations who don't give a damn, quite frankly, about individuals having access to clean water and clean air. Now they have their compliance programs, et cetera, but they are not meaningfully changing their policies. They're doing these sort of optics where they'll have a teeny investment in solar, or they'll have a teeny investment in some alternative, but in reality they are not actually moving to stop this effort. In fact, there was a TV program on CNBC this past year that highlighted Exxon, and it was basically talking about how their drilling operations off the coast of Africa are slated to reach, like I think it was like more than a million, maybe 10 million barrels a day by the year 2100. Like that was their plan. Like they have not altered their plan. And so we have to alter their plans, and we have to use our voices and our whatever power we have to help make these changes possible. But you have to start with knowledge. And I also think, obviously, with climate change being less deniable, not that it was deniable in reality for years now, but being more visible for people, that more and more people are going to say, whoa, wait, we need to stop this. We need to do something. We need to fix this. And so I'm not going to get into the question of what's too late or when is it too late. But the reality is that we have a growing number of people who see what's happening and are going to be eager to have changes to address it.
Yeah, and there's it is very Jim Gurley just posted another really important question. I think another a neighbor of yours in Minnesota, in the frac sand mining area of the country, which has been devastated by fossil fuel corporations and mining operations. He says there's so much to oppose. How do we keep from getting overwhelmed and depressed? And what are your recommendations for that? How do you deal with it when you're really deep in the thick of it at all times, in for putting yourself in positions with these horrible people, looking them in the eye, their dead, soulless, depthless eyes? How do you do it? And do you have any recommendations for the rest of us?
I do, and I will. I know that I saw one question pop through the list just to say, are the Democrats involved? There are currently, I think, no Democratic members of ALEC, but Joe Manchin cut his teeth in ALEC, just FYI. There's a great New Yorker story that a tremendous reporter, Dan Kaufman, did, that if you want to learn more about that and connections for his daughter's company, check it out, New Yorker, Joe Manchin, Dan Kaufman. What do I do? So first of all, I actually paint. That's one of my paintings back there. I paint because it's nonverbal and it doesn't involve me being righteously angry. I also meditate to try to calm myself at times. But I also think, like, first of all, you have to take care of yourself. We have to think of this as a long fight. It's not just a one-day fight. It's a long-term fight. We've got to be healthy. We've got to take care of ourselves. We've got to have, mental health, emotional health support to, stay in this fight. And the second thing is I tell myself that, if we don't fight, we definitely are going to lose. Like, if we do fight, there are things we can change. We can affect change. And I think about how daunting some of the changes that have happened in society are. For 100 years, in the African American community in the United States and the America overall, like since the Civil War until 1964, the civil rights were not protected in America. Now, we've been regressing, obviously, but that was 100-year fight to get the Civil Rights Act from the end of the Civil War. Now, I'm not saying this is a 100-year fight. I actually think it's sooner, and with technology and with the climate changes underway, that it's faster. But that was a 100-year fight, and people passed that fight on, and they pass it on not because people are just good people. It's because these are moral issues about how we treat ourselves, how we treat others, how we are treated, and the same with climate, in the sense that, like, these are moral issues about our very survival. And so of course we're going to fight until we win, or we're going to fight until we lose. But you don't give up just because you didn't win this particular legislative battle, or because they passed this law. That's when we have to use their outrageousness as fuel to double down about why we need more people involved, more people engaged, more people willing to vote, more people willing to speak up, more people willing to stand up. We need more people every time they do something like this, that should be not cause for just feeling disempowered or sad, which it is naturally sad and angering. It needs to be fuel for why we need to ask 2 more people, then another 2 more people to join us in the effort to reform these things, that we can have a democracy and we can have a world that reflects policies that respect our lives and respect and help our planet survive. Anyway,
Yeah,
that's what I thought.
yeah, no, that's true. I mean, anybody with a half a brain and half a heart is filled with grief and rage and frustration and fury all the time. And the good thing is that when I started really being a full-time anti-fossil fuel activist 15 years ago, when fracking came to my neighborhood. And before that, I'd done a lot of other kinds of peace, justice, and environmental work, but this became an obsession. I knew everybody in the fight in the state of New York in 2009. Everybody. I knew everybody until 2015 or 16. And then suddenly, all of a sudden, even though the false announcement was made by certain NGOs and others that New York State had banned fracking, it hadn't. It had a temporary moratorium on certain kinds of fracking. But nevertheless, it was considered a done deal and people dropped out of the fight. But new people became aware of climate change and began joining the fight for other things, for clean energy, stopping the forcing of people to have methane gas stoves in their New York City homes and things like that. And people got involved and they realized that they had to join together. And now I hardly know anyone in the movement, which is a joy. It's a joy to go to a meeting and not know anybody, except the 3 or 4 of us, that I see all the time. But and there are new people, and we do bring in new people all the time. And certainly a year like this, with insane weather things happening all over the world, and people like Kim Stanley Robinson writing novels that wake people up, is really bringing more people into the fight. And we have to be there for one another. I mean, it goes in waves. Our energy and our joy and activism and enjoying being around like-minded people with hearts and solidarity is wonderful. So but you're going to be down tomorrow and I'm going to help lift you up, and vice versa. So that's COVID has stopped a lot of that, because the in-person hugging really meant a lot to us, and the in-person activism, being in the streets together or chained together or whatever, was really soul uplifting. And we didn't have that for the last few years, but it's coming back if we keep ourselves healthy and safe. I think, being back in solidarity in person is wonderful. And bring food, bring food. I think everything needs food. Every event that we host I wish we could do this in person, but we're all over the country and all over the world, actually. I think several of us from other countries right now. So I want to give you the last word, Lisa. Wrap any thoughts, or actually we have about 9 minutes left, so I'm going to open up the floor. If anyone wants to raise your hand, I can call on you if you have a direct question for Lisa, or for system change, either one of us. Oh, I see Jim Gurley. Would you like to ask your question directly? Are you there? I can ask you to unmute. Or would you like me to ask it? There you go. Jim, we can't hear you. Your setting might be wrong on your, I'm going to ask it for you. It says, he asked what to do about the Supreme Court, expand its numbers, legislation to curtail their power. Any way to oust Thomas and Alito? Got a magic bullet?
No, we are working hard to help expose the corruption at the court. My team has been involved in helping to share research and information so people understand how this court is not is not one of integrity, is not one that can be trusted with these decisions. People like Alito and Thomas, who can't file basic instructions for sharing information about gifts of private jet travel, how can we trust them at all to be interpreting our First Amendment or other rights? I mean, we can't, obviously. One of the positive outcomes of the disastrous decisions that the court has been issuing, as well as of this wave of investigative reporting, is that there's growing receptivity to reform of the court. More and more groups than ever before have embraced the idea of term limits as a way to remove justices because of the difficulty of doing so through the impeachment process, which starts in the House and then requires a supermajority in the Senate to win a conviction, which we couldn't even get on Trump. Not that they shouldn't be pursued where impeachment is warranted, and I think it is warranted. But the chances of surviving the Republican Senate in terms of getting a conviction are slim. It's still worth pursuing those things, in my view. But the calls for reform are growing, and it's only going to grow louder as this court continues to try to limit our freedoms. So I'm very hopeful about the prospect for reform, and having a Congress and a president willing to support that reform as people call for it, demand it, because this court is not. They may have pumped the brakes on one decision this year, possibly two, but that is just a temporary step. They have a supermajority that is desirous of rolling back the clock on the 21st century in America, and we are going to have to be united in opposing that, and that includes their efforts to try to limit our ability to mitigate climate change through various rules that they're interposing. Yeah, that's my answer.
Paul Flansburgh, you want to go ahead with your question about the legislators?
Yeah, so I understand system change, not climate change. Our system is so corrupted that our elected officials don't represent us anymore. Because there's times when the Progressive Caucus could have flexed their arms, flexed their muscles, and advanced legislation that's more favorable to us, but they chose not to. I'm thinking of more war-related circumstances than environmental causes in particular, because those seem to come to the fore most in my experience. So that being said, I mean, I've heard in the past it said to change everything, we need everyone. In this last election, almost half of the voting population, almost half, and the greatest number ever counted to vote for a president, voted for Trump, but for Biden. So we need half the country to be on our side. Otherwise, at least some of that half to be on our side. Otherwise, we're going to lose. And the system it seems to be rigged against having a majority hold sway. So
Is there a direct question here, Paul?
Yeah. So how do we acknowledge the Trump almost majority in a way that will promote our cause?
Well, I think first of all, I call it the losing side of that equation and not ever the almost majority. But I take your point in terms of the actual vote, that it was close. It was closer than it should have been, given everything we saw and everything that was manifest. When I look at the election in 2016 and 2020 and beyond, and 2018 and 2022, what I see are a couple things. First of all, the reality is that the majority in America doesn't vote, right? So of the majority that votes, the Democrats have prevailed in 2018, 2020, and in many races in 2022. But there are a lot of people who aren't voting, who feel like it doesn't work, or it not convenient for them, or that doesn't matter to them. And that audience, I feel like, is worth reaching out to. People who don't vote, who could vote, who should vote, who have a stake in this, who are getting screwed under the rules as they exist, and urge them to vote. I don't know that trying to convince someone who's in the cult to leave, if their family members haven't been able to convince them, I can't convince them, like that's not, I don't have those magic words. But there are people who haven't paid attention. They're focused on other things, like life is hard. The economy has been really challenging. There's all sorts of things happening, but getting more people to vote who don't vote can help build those majorities, the majorities we need to have genuine progressive change.
I don't want to interrupt you, but you
Yeah.
did mention cult. And
Yeah.
I don't think the majority of people who voted for Trump are cultists.
No, I think that's right. You're right. They're not all. And that was probably an overstatement, maybe 25% or something in that range. But the thing is that I think that there are people, and I'm not one of them, but there are people who probably can reach some of the people who did vote that way, despite the evidence that that was manifest. And there are groups that are doing that. The Bulwark is working on targeting Republicans and independents. There are others who are targeting Republican voters who still stuck with Trump in 2020, but who perhaps could be persuaded by the criminal indictments for mishandling our state secrets and possibly doing more with our state secrets in Mar-a-Lago and more, that they might be persuaded. That there are people in the military or former veterans who could be persuaded. I think we need to pursue all of those possible target audiences. I myself, though, for the people who are wearing the Trump flag, et cetera, I'm not focused on them. Best wishes to them. I hope they're healthy. I hope they eventually wake up, but I don't think I have the words to change their views.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We have to know where to put our energies. There are some causes that are hopeless for us. We can't waste our time on those. It's just like appealing to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or as we also call the Federal Energy Rubber Stamp Commission, to stop permitting pipelines. They permit 99.17% of every single proposal that goes in front of them from a fossil fuel company. We can't just appeal. We have to stop writing letters to the departments of environmental conservation and protection and whatever they're called in our various states. Those tactics have been tried over and over again and they fail. And the definition of insanity or stupidity is doing the same thing over and over again and thinking we're going to have a different result, right? We all know that, but we keep doing it because we've been sent down the chute of regulatory cattle chute to continue doing things because they've always been done that way. That's the way we learned how to do them. We don't have any other means. Well, we're creative, we're brilliant, we're passionate people. Surely we can come up with other ways than following the rules that were set up to thwart us. So with that, Joel is going to have one last quick question, then Lisa's going to wrap. And we will do our best to respond to anybody who hasn't been responded to. Lisa, I know you probably don't have time to, but I'll do my best to answer questions that are remaining. And anybody, I will once again put our contact info in the chat. So please do get in touch. We could use your help. We're not many. We're mighty, but not many. And we need more to build our might. And I thank you all for coming today. And Joel, quick question, please. And Lisa.
Oh, do you hear me?
Oop.
Do you hear me?
No, it's a very bad echo. You want to type it in the chat and we'll try to respond. Lisa can respond. Oh, maybe you have your phone on as well as a computer. That would be giving you the feedback.
Now you're muted. Turn off your mute.
Try turning it off if you've turned your phone off.
Right. Do you hear me?
No, it's echoing like crazy. So just type your
Do you hear me
question.
now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. That's it.
Do you hear me now? No?
Yes, that's good.
Okay.
Oh no, now we lost you. We can't hear you.
Do you hear me now?
Try.
Do you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. There's a lot of local places. I'm with the National Lawyers Guild Environmental Justice Committee, and there's been different places like Summerfield, Massachusetts, and other places that have really progressive towns and town codes, and they've come up with model codes in terms of really pro-environment. I think one of the ways to fight back is almost using the ALEC model, is that to secure the small places that we have solid representation on, and to build upon that. You know, rather than trying to get the Texas legislature to change or whatever. So I guess I'm making a request that if we could work together in terms of coming up with codes that people could use. And we're also finding that if it's a model code, it's something they could present to the local legislature and build upon. So my question is, you know, your view on you know, from the ground up, local legislative lobbying.
Let me just say, I'm gonna hold on. Can you hear me now? All right.
Mhm.
I'm gonna just share my screen one last time before we wrap here, which is that this is a sign of great hope, and hats off to you, Joel. Thank you for that question. This is the reality. We see these maps as red, but in reality, these are blue cities all over the country where we have tremendous potential for progress. There's efforts by states to preempt that local control, but Joel's exactly right. Those local actions can build momentum and build power, and sort of overtake this idea of we living in this sort of red state country. We actually live in a blue state country where a huge portion of our population is in cities and towns, obviously, but cities where there is the possibility of making change. So hats off to you, Joel, and to the National Lawyers Guild and the committee's efforts to move that forward. I'm going to just do this one thing, which I never do, but I feel like it's warranted in this instance to close, which is to say, I am so grateful for all of you, for all of your many efforts that I don't know about to really make the world a better place. I know because you're here, you are committed to this, and you are devoted to trying to protect our planet and protect our future. And so let me just do just a little roll call to say thank you, Joel, Mara, Karen, Susie, Steve, Adelaide, Jim, Paul, Tony, Bill, Luz, Lawrence, James, George, Kenneth, Joe, Margaret, Kim, Mary, and I hope I'm not going to duplicate, but Shoto, Eddie and Dave, Heidi, Marilyn, Tamika, Shoshana, Mary, Lisa, Leonard, Tahira, Mary, and someone at 510. Thank you so much deeply for everything you do to really help protect our planet, to protect our democracy. I'm honored to be part of this conversation with you all, and I look forward to working in solidarity with you to really help address these challenges together. So thank you so much, Mara, for the invitation, and thank you all for your tremendous efforts, which aren't on this webinar, but I know are making a difference and will continue to make a difference if we just continue to not give up and move together into the future to fight these challenges. So thank you so much. Thank you all.